You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast produced by Veteran Strategies and featuring conversations with fascinating and impactful men and women who have shaped our world, our communities, and our history. My name is Robert Vane, Principal of Veteran Strategies, and your host for our discussion. You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, a local veteran public relations enterprise, and sponsored by Girl Scouts of Central Indiana, Garmon Construction, Leaders and Legends LLC, the Grand Hall and Conference Center at Historic Union Station, the McGinley's Golden Ace Inn, and McAllister Machinery, your friendly neighborhood Caterpillar dealer. You may find all your sales and rental equipment needs at McAllister.com. We are pleased to announce our podcast is a member of the All Indiana Podcast Network in partnership with Wish TV. You may find Leaders and Legends at allindianapodcastnetwork.com. Thinking of starting a podcast or need to host a public meeting? Let Leaders and Legends LLC be your partner as you look for new ways to communicate your message. Please contact Chris Spangle and me at leadersandlegends.net. Thank you for joining us on the Leaders and Legends podcast. Our guest today is me.
That's right. And I'm your host. Me.
Your host
yeah.
is Chris Spangle, the newly married to the incredibly attractive and wonderful and really sweet, a perfect partnership for you, Chris. The Leaders and Legends community is thrilled for you personally. We love you. You work hard. You're a great person. You have one of the best senses of humor I've ever encountered. And congratulations.
Thank you so much. Yeah, it was perfect. We got married in Panama City and then went to the Dominican Republic. And I've been on a beach most of this month and I didn't want to come back. I love Indiana, but I don't want to be here. I want to be back in 86-degree weather and
so when we have these economic leaders on the podcast and they say, you know, we don't have mountains, we don't have beaches. Now you can go, I get that.
Yeah. Everybody in the Dominican Republic that you run into is like super happy. All the employees on these resorts, all the shopkeepers. It's like they live soaking in vitamin D and paradise, eating pineapple for breakfast. Like it was great. So yeah, we're thankful and thank you to you. I mean, this opportunity to produce your podcast has been a lot of fun. Your friendship has meant a lot, and then the money helped pay for the wedding. so I appreciate it.
Well, this is our third podcast retrospective, I believe, or at least we're in our third year, about to enter 2022. We just posted our 150th podcast, and that was the one we recorded with Brad Chambers, the CEO of the IEDC and Secretary of Commerce. Never thought, quite candidly, Chris, that we would hit this mark. We wouldn't have made it without your expertise for sure.
Whenever I'm doing podcast consulting, I always say to them, like, listen, you need to enjoy doing your podcast because 9 months from now, you're going to want to quit. And that feeling never really goes away, but you still love it so much you want to keep doing it.
Well, it's a part-time gig for me, for sure, other than my public relations business. But your expertise and your understanding and knowledge of the podcast community as a whole, I mean, it shows up in the podcast consulting you do for some of our clients and in our conversations. But 150 podcasts, does that put us towards the top of kind of the local podcasts with regard to longevity?
Most podcasts, like 60% of podcasts, there's 4 million podcasts. And I think it's 64% of those never make it to episode 10. People get into it and they realize it's a lot of work. I mean, it's a labor of love, like you mentioned, which kind of leads to the first question here. I mean, how do you pick who you want to talk to when you're doing these interviews? Like, how do you make the decision of what you want to talk about?
We've been lucky in the sense, and maybe this is something we'll get into later. The irony is that the pandemic has made it easier to keep the podcast going because of the familiarity with Zoom and the fact that this allows or has allowed us to interview historians from not only across the United States, but we obviously had Professor Susanna Lipscomb Zoom from Oxford, England, to talk about her scholarship in the Tudor period. So people who you never could have reached, right? Now you can reach them because that's just the way people are doing things these days. So I thought the pandemic was really going to kill it because you weren't going to do anything face to face, and you didn't really have the technology, or at least it wasn't as well known or as frequently used. And now you just send a Zoom link and everyone's like, yeah, okay, I know how to do that.
Yeah, some of these historians, I mean, they're older, and having podcasted since 2007, up until the pandemic, I mean, trying to get an economics professor in 2013 to use Skype was nearly impossible. So it's really opened up a bunch of new opportunities. I mean, and I know we're kind of going back to 2020, but it all feels like one long year. Did you kind of wonder, like, what, is this the end of the podcast? Because it was so much fun to get to go talk to people in person. And I think we counted it up. We only had 5 in-person interviews this year. Let's see, who was that? Paul Lucian, Paul Page,
Brad Chambers.
Yeah, Murray Clark, Kip 2, Jim Shella. I mean, so
Al Unser Jr.
Do you miss going out and meeting people in person and talking to them in person, or what are the benefits of doing it on Zoom worth it?
The in-person interviews are more fun just because you get to interact in a way that you don't over the screen. But if it hadn't been for the pandemic / Zoom or Teams or whatever you want to use, right, then the part of the podcast that allows me to exercise my nerd muscle to a greater degree wouldn't have happened.
The Arnold Schwarzenegger muscle, then.
Well, it's just so fascinating that these historians have consented to come on. And the other thing where we've gotten lucky, quite frankly, is that now we have publishing houses out of New York City and other places reaching out to us when they have an author who wants to promote, his or her book.
This is the funniest thing. This is a behind the scenes thing. Robert is completely, is chagrin the right word? Like, you cannot believe that these people want to come on your show. I'm like, they want to sell a book, and then like they have the best interview. I mean, I've worked in radio for 20 years. Radio people are the laziest people, and podcast people are kind of lazy too. So they'll go on these shows and nobody will have read the book. They won't even have read the PDF that comes with the book. And so Richard Nixon and Watergate, tell us about that. Meanwhile, they come on you, and then you detail what was in the 18 minutes of lost tape, and these guys are just all fascinated by how in-depth you can go with them, that you've read their book. And of course, they've gone to Simon & Schuster and these publishing houses and said, I actually really enjoyed this. Track that. I bet he sold some books. And when you find somebody who's really interested in so many veins of history like you are, combined with a fun conversation about it, I don't know why you're so surprised that these guys want to come on your show.
Well, it's the East Side mentality. That's part of it, right? And the other part is, there's lots of history podcasts out there. Now, how many of those history podcasts are hosted by someone who enjoys history as much as I do? I don't know. You're a history buff. We have plenty of friends who are big history nuts. And so, it's my kids joke that my graduate degree in medieval history is, how do I even pay the light bill? Like, it's so worthless. How do I make money off of it? And then I just laugh and go, well, this is the only time it actually comes in handy, so I may as well use it.
The high school, I mean, it was like when I was in high school, and have you ever seen when the Beatles would go to Shea Stadium? That was Robert when Susanna Lipscomb came on the show. The medieval historian, she came on, and they just, it was so funny. You were fangirling. I think it's cute. I love it.
Well, first off, she agreed to Zoom in the evening in Great Britain at 9:00 to fit our timeline. She's probably the most famous Tudor historian of the Tudor period in the world.
Easily.
She has sold untold hundreds of thousands of copies of books, has hundreds of thousands of social media followers. And all I did was send her an email and said, hey, would you come on? And it took a while to make the schedule work. She was a wonderful interview, incredibly gracious, obviously beyond intelligent and informed. And, we were lucky enough. We asked her some questions that she hadn't had before. And I think that was something that kind of made her more into the podcast, for lack of a better term. I think she started, who's the most overrated person in Tudor history? We don't post the video in these podcasts, but the look on her face was scrunchy. Like, I'm getting ready to give an answer and you're not going to believe it. Her answer was Queen Elizabeth. And so, yeah, that was pretty special because you want that sort of outside validation, right? You want the folks to come on. And I've said this before, the best way to get really cool guests on your podcast is to get really cool guests on your podcast.
Yeah. Once you interviewed Mitch Daniels, a lot of people started saying yes. And I think that kind of bore fruit this year. Like when you look at the roster this year, Marianne Glick, Marlon Jackson, Mitch Daniels came back on, Barry Collier, Doug Bowles, Robin Miller, Frank O'Bannon had an all-star cast in that retrospective, Fred Glass, Gary Dick, like these, Frank Anderson, Paul Page. You started to see like higher profile people locally say yes, and I think that's partly because you had Mitch Daniels on, and that opened up a lot of interviews. Oh, well, if he's comfortable enough to come on twice, then I can too.
Yeah, there's no doubt about that Governor Daniels coming on the podcast. I mean, and I don't bury the lead, right? So when I ask somebody who I think would know or be an admirer of Mitch Daniels, that's the first name I mention. We have not posted this podcast yet. It'll be posted at the beginning of 2022. But when I had a chance to pitch a podcast appearance to George Will, the first name I mentioned as a previous guest was Mitch Daniels, because they're friends and are mutual admirers of each other. And so, you look at that, it's the Seinfeld episode where I think it's the Bizarro Jerry, where George Costanza has the picture of the beautiful girl with man hands who's Jerry is dating, and he uses the picture of her to get into the exclusive club with all the models.
Yeah.
And, he says his hand is stamped. He can come and go as he pleases. And so, with Governor Daniels, he kind of stamped my hand. And, without him, does Governor Evan Bayh come on? I don't know.
Yeah. So,
and Evan Bayh was a terrific interview. He was an incredibly gracious interview.
I'm the former executive director of the Libertarian Party of Indiana. You're the former communications director of the state Republican Party. What the heck is this podcast doing, having retrospectives on Julia Carson and Frank O'Bannon and having Evan Bayh on? Why would you focus on Democrats? What the heck's up with that, Robert?
Am I on Abdul at large? Is that what I've morphed to?
That's where I learned how to pitch that question, yeah.
Because I'm a Republican with a podcast. It's not a Republican podcast. And, Evan Bayh doesn't get elected without the votes of hundreds of thousands of Republicans. If you don't think that Frank O'Bannon was an honorable man, or that Julia Carson didn't make a disproportionate impact on her district and community, then you're just not paying attention. I mean, the goal of the podcast is to talk about leaders and legends, not just Republican leaders and legends. If that's the case, then I'd just have Greg Ballard on every week.
I don't think he'd do it
for a different segment on his time as mayor. So, we want to be, as I've said this, I don't know if I've said this on the podcast, but I say it to people who come on the podcast. And that is Leaders and Legends is designed to be informative, entertaining, and comfortable. We want folks to come on here and have a good time. And we want the people to listen to go, okay, that was an hour well spent. No one made me mad, unless I'm a Purdue fan and I've had to listen to Ray Tolbert, right? talk about IU winning a national championship. I mean, there's plenty of podcasts out there that'll tickle your political fancy, and listen to all those you want. But, what we want to do is talk to people about their careers. One of the very first podcasts that we did earlier in the year, it was talking with people who were in the room when really cool things happened, right? I mean, it was for Marlon Jackson to detail what it was like to intercept Tom Brady to seal the Colts' trip to the Super Bowl, in which Peyton Manning won his first ring when they defeated the Bears. I mean, what percentage of people in the entire world can say that they were a part of such an amazing sports moment, let alone one here in Indianapolis? And he came on and he talked about other things too. But that's what we want to do. We want to talk to people who have done great things, who have been involved in great things, who have written about great things or great people. And one of the things that has happened in 2021 is we've been able to do that.
Yeah, I mean, so some of my favorite interviews, or not interviews, but podcast episodes are the bipartisan, sadly not tripartisan, where Murray Clark, Kip 2, and Jim Shella, for instance, get together in a room. I love when Shella's on, because Shella's kind of mentioning about 10% of the stories he's able to tell on the podcast.
That's pretty fair.
Yeah. And it's always fun to do those in person because you get to hear some of those off air. But yeah, I mean, where did you get the idea of doing some of those bipartisan podcasts, and what are some things that you've learned doing them?
That R's and D's have the same problems, that they get the same grief. One of the things I want to say is very quickly is to talk about how much fun it is when Jim does join.
Yeah.
He does make it, we have a situation where, Jim, for example, we did a podcast with Becky Skillman, and we did one with former Lieutenant Governor, and we did one with Evan Bayh, former governor, former United States Senator. And, Jim covered them when they were at the State House. And some of the other political people we've had, like, he's had friendships with them for years and years. And I just enjoy the podcast more when he's on it, because he brings so much more to it than just me. Because, I mean, he was interacting with the Biden administration every day for 8 years. Yeah,
he's not afraid to be cheeky at times. You're cheeky, but you don't do it on air. But he's not afraid to do it. Where he kind of knows. This will kind of elicit a bit of a laugh and a chuckle.
Well, he's retired, so
yeah.
He can say what he wants.
Yeah. Well, and the thing, with him is just like the historians with you. He's well prepared. He knows the right questions to ask.
Well, and he doesn't have to. He can bring up, I was at the news conference at which you said, I was at the stop in Brownsburg at which you said, talk to me about that. Those are the things that are really fun to have Jim pull those stories out. And I think in particular, the Evan Bayh podcast was really enhanced by Jim's presence, because, he becomes governor in 88. Evan Bayh becomes Secretary of State in 86, governor in 88, and then senator in 98. Yeah, senator in 98. And so that's really when Jim's career at Channel 8 was in its stride, right? Like, he was had really fired things up by then, and was clearly the most active and strongest, I would say, State House reporter. So having Jim be able to talk to Evan Bayh about the Evan Bayh years, I mean, the best thing I can do when that happened is just be quiet. There's plenty of stuff for me to talk about. But Jim really hits it out of the park when he's talking to folks like that, elected officials whom he covered. Even in the Frank O'Bannon and last year, the Joe Kernan retrospective, Jim was just so good.
Who's your co-host on the Frank Anderson podcast?
It's Kevin Murray, who's an attorney.
Not many podcasts invite guest co-hosts, but you do. But it was funny how I don't think you asked a single question in that podcast.
I did not.
You're unique in that you turned it over to the other person, our friends at the Girl Scouts, and you let them ask questions.
Well, for Kevin Murray was Sheriff Frank Anderson's attorney, and Kevin's an East Sider. He's a Cena grad and a good friend of the Golden Ace. And I really wanted to have Sheriff Anderson on the podcast to talk about his career. And the best way to make the sheriff comfortable was to have Kevin be a part of it. And so, it's about documenting history and people's careers and events. And so, if I keep my mouth shut for an hour, I survived.
And all were better for it. You
really did. You mentioned this earlier, though. Let me say the Kip to Murray Clark. You like when the R's and D's get together, and
I love it. Yeah. Oh, and you mentioned the R's and D's have the same problem. When you did the episode with Robin Winston and Mike McDaniel,
correct,
and they talked about how the northern counties always gave them the most. All you care about is Indianapolis. I had the same problem. I mean, at the Libertarian Party, that specific episode, if you listen to those two state chairs talk about what it's like to run a state political party, they had the same exact experience as I had. I mean, I had them in smaller doses, obviously, but I think it's partly because I connect to some of these stories and kind of have some of the same lived experiences, and I also was around for some of it. Murray Clark, when I was a young Republican, a college Republican president, I was in rooms with Murray Clark watching him do his thing. So it's kind of fun to listen to him do that. But I enjoy watching Jim Shella have fun with his friends. I think that's also part of it. Is I think that's
and the political ones especially, because they're a little more lighthearted, right? It's not the
I think it's like things today, and I basically retired from politics in 2012 in my very non-illustrious political career as a party hack, and it was so different. I started working on Andy Horning's campaign with against Julia Carson, and, listening to that retrospective, it kind of brings back memories of when things were a little bit different. Things are so cutthroat now and so much more divided even within the parties that hearing two people who you whipped my butt on that one. The thing is not having the anger in it. There's no anger in these conversations that I enjoy.
Well, the thing about Kip was he had to endure the discussion about 2004 when he was Indiana state Democratic Party chairman, and his mentor in some ways, certainly someone about whom he cares deeply, Joe Kernan, lost to Mitch Daniels, and Mitch Daniels' campaign chairman that year was Murray Clark. So Kip had to endure that discussion about the Daniels election in 2004. And I think I even said this on the podcast, don't worry, Kip, we'll get to 2008 when Barack Obama wins Indiana, because, Kip was so instrumental into that campaign that made history. First time a Democrat had won in a presidential race since 1964 in Indiana. But I also thought when it came to the Barack Obama campaign, Murray Clark was particularly interesting in his comments, that they were like, look, you got to spend money here. You got to come up, you got to do something here. And that the McCain campaign wouldn't, basically with the theory that, well, if we have to spend money in Indiana, then we don't have a chance. We're not going to win anyway. And so Barack Obama didn't win by much, but that was an interesting juxtaposition where Murray, who had a very, very, and he's my former boss at State Party, had a very successful run as chairman. That was kind of the one race that you could tell he wished that it had gone the other way. Turned out it didn't make a difference in in the overall presidential election. It wasn't like Indiana swung it to Obama. And then Kip had to, talk about what it was like to be chairman when his number one guy, loses. And those are, you can't get into politics and get too high and get too low. And I think that was part of what came out. Both of them had some strong wins and some losses that clearly stuck with them. I mean, Murray was a losing lieutenant governor candidate in 2000 with David McIntosh. And so the the thrill of victory and agony of defeat, I think, comes through in these bipartisan podcasts. And again, that's where Jim Shella really is such a great co-host, because he was at these rallies, he was at these debates, that kind of stuff. And that just brings a flavor to the podcast that you wouldn't get if it was just me. Just like Danielle does, when she joins the podcast, it's not just for the female guests, but mostly, Danielle's one of the most dynamic leaders in the state and has a terrific reputation for what she's doing at the Girl Scouts and a superb background in education. So when Katie Jenner, the Secretary of Education, comes on the podcast, you do your intro and you tell Danielle to do her thing. Yeah,
I think, did she bring on Marianne Glick as well?
Correct.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's
Kathy Langham as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's, I think it's important. And one of the things that you do, I love the partnership with the Girl Scouts because it just keeps it from being a boys club. And it's not that you don't want to reach out to female leaders. It's just that I think people live in their zone. They talk to their friends, and then, she brings in people like Sarah Taylor or even Marlon Jackson. The Girl Scouts brought in a couple of boys. Stuart Goodwin at the Indiana War Memorials. Kathy Langham, Claudia Cummings, yes, excuse me, I almost said Cummins, and Katie Jenner. So talk about, interviewing and Marianne Glick. I don't know if I mentioned her. These are really impressive female leaders, and Amanda Kingsbury and Leslie Bailey at Indy Maven. I hadn't heard of Indy Maven until that interview, and now I see it everywhere. So talk about why it's important for you to have diversity on the show, to kind of expand beyond your own horizons in who you select as a guest to interview.
Well, that is one thing. The Girl Scouts have such a terrific network. Not that I didn't know some of the people they've brought on. Obviously, I'd known General Goodwin for a while, and Teresa Lubbers. And we've got more guests coming of that, who have excelled in Indianapolis and in Indiana, that the Girl Scouts are going to bring on. And we're thrilled with that. Ann Mertlow is coming on, and that's through the Girl Scouts. Danielle's a great co-host. She's got a wonderful personality. She brings a lot to the podcast when she comes on. She's obviously very busy, and we enjoy it when she can come on. But the Girl Scouts network is terrific. It's not just all girls, it's girls and boys. And so anyone that she wants to have on, we usually try really hard to make it happen. I think the one thing that I would say about Danielle is her background in education is really important. She can talk about those issues in a way that I just can't. Not that I don't have education clients or haven't worked in the education world, I have, but not even close to the same degree that Danielle has. And so that perspective that she brings is really fun, because then it allows her to do a deep dive into something about which she is so passionate, and that is education here in Indiana.
Now, I think you just misunderstood the question. I don't think you're whipping out your PR tactics on me and just avoiding the question. Why make it broader? Not just about the Girl Scouts, but talking to a variety of different people, not just women, but leaders from a variety of segments. People like Alan Sir Jr. in sports, or Jack Swarbrick. Why do you talk to such a diverse group of people instead of niching down into focusing on one group?
Well, one of the reasons is it would probably just get boring. You'd end up plowing over the same ground. I was thrilled to talk to Al Unser Jr. I like sports. Excuse me. I'm not a motorsports expert by any stretch, but he is a 2-time winner of the Indianapolis 500 and probably had a stretch as the most popular race car driver in the country. And for us to be able to sit down, thank you, Norma Lawrence, by the way, be able to sit down with him and have a great conversation. It was just so fun. I mean, people want to hear from, not that I would compare myself to these folks. I'm not, but whether it's Charlie Rose or other Larry King, they just didn't stick to one particular group of people. There's people say, if you could have anyone on in the world, that kind of question, right? It's almost unanswerable, because if you choose Paul McCartney, then that means you're not choosing Queen Elizabeth, which means you're not choosing Michael Jordan, right? The list goes on and on. And so I want to have some variety and talk about different subject matters and people who've excelled, whether it's nonprofit or government or sports, journalism. As a historian or biographer, we've had a Pulitzer Prize winner on the podcast, Edward Larson. And so to the extent that we can keep that sort of eclectic nature of the podcast going, we definitely want to do so.
Yeah, I think it comes down to stories. I mean, there's great stories everywhere. The stories that, Paul Page told were as interesting to me as like hearing Katie Jenner's arc. Becky Skillman's story, I thought was such a great story, starting as, was she a clerk and then working her way up and all the things she's doing now, like just tons of great stories.
What about her high school nickname?
What was it? I forget.
Hot Rod.
Yeah, I mean, all of these, everybody that you've had on, I mean, talk about storytellers, people like Robin Miller,
Yeah, rest in peace. What a good man.
So I think it comes down to just really, if there's an interesting story to tell in a person's career or an interesting story to tell in Van Halen. And I mean, Brad Tolinski, I was just riveted to hearing his conversation about Eddie Van Halen. And I don't know that I necessarily would have chosen to listen to that podcast, but once I did, I was like, I'm glad I did. It was a really interesting story. Same with Bob Orr. I don't really know Bob Orr, but it was an interesting story.
Well, Mark Lubber's saying right out of the gate that Otis Bowen is the most overrated person and was a lousy governor. I thought that was an interesting way to start that podcast.
Pulled quote.
Not unpredictable, but it's certainly a conversation starter. Glad you liked Brad Tolinski because he's coming back on the podcast to discuss his book about Jimmy Page.
Right. You think if you listen to Paul Lucian, you're going to hear him talk about business training. Then he talks about being a cop. I was like, what?
Yeah, absolutely right.
Yeah.
And the other good thing, and I'm going to thank our sponsors here in a second. The other good thing is like for Becky Skillman, right? I saw her pull into the State House parking lot in that Mercedes. I don't know how many times, her little racer Mercedes coupe, and just thought, man, I wonder if she gets any grief for that. Like, I wonder if someone hasn't said, hey, look, you should probably buy an American car or something else. Right. And the podcast was a chance to ask her about it. And I thought her answer was basically like, go to hell. I'll drive what I want. I'm paraphrasing. But, for me to be able to ask her that question after 10, 12 years was kind of fun just to get her answer, because she's no longer lieutenant governor. She's no longer an elected official, which means you can let your guard down a little bit, be a little more forthcoming. You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, a local veteran public relations enterprise, and sponsored by Girl Scouts of Central Indiana, Garmon Construction, Leaders and Legends LLC, the Grand Hall and Conference Center at Historic Union Station, the McGinley's Golden Ace Inn, and McAllister Machinery, your friendly neighborhood Caterpillar dealer. You may find all your sales and rental equipment needs at McAllister.com. This is our 2021 Leaders and Legends podcast retrospective, hosted by engineer extraordinaire Chris Spangle. Chris, did you have a particular moment that took you aback listening to the podcast where you went, man, I never knew that, or I'd never heard that before?
Yes, I've got to think of what it was. I didn't know that Paul Page was in a helicopter crash, which I found really interesting. That
shows how young you are.
Yeah, right. There's always every time there's something that kind of there's always one little nugget. Like Brad Chambers talking about his mom. I thought that was one of my favorite stories of the year, of making his mom plow hit the roads, and then he didn't pay her. And then
he stiffed. He said, I stiffed. Didn't he say I stiffed her?
Yeah. To learning about Bob Orr and Frank O'Bannon and kind of hearing some of those stories. Al Unser Jr., I've looked up to him for a long time, just as a race car driver. He won the first 500 I went to. Really enjoyed that one. There's I enjoyed the history podcast a lot, and that kind of is one of my questions. I mean, I'll be candid, when we started this, it's like, okay, well, there's definitely 50 people to interview in Indianapolis. Excuse me, I still have some laryngitis. I didn't think there'd be 150 people to interview in Indianapolis. I mean, I wondered if we would eventually run out of people to talk to. That hasn't been the case. But when you look at kind of the future of the program, do you still kind of see it as, I'm gonna keep focusing on Indianapolis. I'm gonna focus more on the history podcasts, like some of the Alan Gelzo podcast, or Craig Simons, or William Stern Randall, or do you still see it kind of being a mix of the two?
Probably a mix of the two for now. There are so many people here in Indiana. I'm talking to you, Larry Bird, and Peyton Manning, and Reggie Miller, and the list goes on and on. Mike Pence, Mike Pence is the only living governor or lieutenant governor who we've yet to talk with.
But here's the problem with that. I'll ask this artfully. Part of the charm of Murray Clark and Kip 2 is that they can look back. Isn't it kind of hard to interview somebody like Mike Pence when he's in the middle of it still?
Depends on what he's in the middle of. I mean, he spent 4 years, and I don't know if we can get him. He is writing a book, so maybe that will be the opportunity. To your point though, we've interviewed Evan Bayh. Evan Bayh had 4 chiefs of staff. We've interviewed 3 of them. The only person we haven't interviewed is the current mayor of Indianapolis, Joe Hogsett, who was Evan Bayh's chief of staff. I know the mayor would come on. He's talked to me about it, but he's pretty busy, so we'll probably leave him alone for a while. I'd love to have Eric Holcomb, the governor, come back on, maybe towards the end of his second term, if we are still around, to talk about what it was like to lead us during the pandemic and win a second term and everything. He was very gracious with his time.
Rob Kendall as co-host?
No, Rob Kendall as co-host. And we would do a situation where I think we could try to make it as lighthearted as possible. Now, there's some other elected officials we haven't had on. We've struck out on a few people. I really wanted to interview Lee Hamilton. We just weren't able to get him, and haven't been able to get him. Joe Donnelly's people expressed an interest in having him come on, but he's in Rome at the Vatican. But maybe when he comes back, there's so many. Actually, I think I've told you this before, that I have printed the list of the living legends from the Indiana Historical Society, and we've been able to get several of them. But there's a lot more people out there. I confess that the history programs, the podcast I do with them, are a lot of fun, because so many of the authors who we've talked to, their books have been on my shelves for years, and to get a chance to have a conversation with them is really thrilling.
I guess who have been some of the most helpful behind the scenes people? I would guess the Benner brothers, as the Bob and Tom Web director. Every time I talk to Bill Benner or his brother, the Benner brothers bit comes back to my mind. But Bill Benner has been a real friend of this program. And can you just talk about how many interviews he's helped set up, including his brother David, I'm sure.
Well, quite a few. I mean, David was big. He certainly helped with Robin Miller and appeared on that podcast. We're hoping to have him come on for a couple of more. He was very helpful. I would definitely say that Danielle Shockey from the Girl Scouts, our sometimes co-host. I mean, she's always coming up with ideas. We were actually just emailing back and forth about a few just not that long ago. Dina Potter, who works for Danielle, does her PR for the Girl Scouts, the communications. She's very helpful. And, the thing about Jim Shella is he's always willing to come on, and that makes a difference. I think when I say, hey, come on the podcast, and Jim Shella is going to co-host, they probably know him better than they know me, and it makes them feel comfortable. And then there's a whole bunch of people I've never met, and those are the publicists who work for the publishing houses in New York City and other places who reach out to me and try to book these guests. You know, it takes a lot of effort to try to find people. Sometimes you're like, oh my God, where am I possibly going to find? And then, 2 weeks later, I've got 7 or 8 podcasts just waiting to be recovered. But there's so many business leaders who I've not yet talked to, who I'd really enjoy interviewing, whether that's the CEO over at Lilly or at Cummins and other places. I'd really like to talk to them, but they've got a lot of demands on their time, and you have to be cognizant of that. And there's a few younger people who I haven't talked to yet. JMV, who Bill Benner, I think, is going to try to make that happen. And quite a few people in communities that we need to explore more, where I know folks and need to try to have them on in a way to talk about what they're doing in the community. The podcast isn't necessarily issue-based. We're more personality-based. Mm-hmm. And so sometimes you have to think about maybe expanding that a bit.
Yeah, that's kind of the hard part about a show about leaders and legends. They're kind of, they've accomplished things, but you want highlight leaders and legends in other areas. So what has stood out to you? What are a couple nuggets that you found interesting? I'll turn the question back on you.
The fact that Robin Miller would come on the podcast when he clearly was not feeling that well, and subsequently passed away. That was really nice of him. He didn't have to do that. He had a lot of demands and, wasn't feeling great. And, thank you to Bill Benner for making that happen.
And he had such great energy too in that episode.
Oh, he just had, story after story after story where he kept throwing it back to Bill. Like, remember that, Bill? Remember when we were there? That's what makes it really, really fun. Allison Barber's story about working in the Pentagon was I thought very compelling. I enjoyed Mitch Daniels coming on. The first time he was on the podcast, we didn't talk about his time as governor at all. And so the second time when he came on again, we talked about his 8 years as governor. I thought he was very generous with his time, told great stories, he gave as typical Mitch Daniels fashion, right? You ask direct questions, you get direct answers.
Yep.
And that was a lot of fun. And he came on, when the pandemic was still a big, to the extent that it's not, but still a big part of what he had to deal with every day as president of Purdue University, for sure. I really enjoyed having my friend Michael Huber on. As far as the people who've come on to whom I'm personally closest to, he would be right up there, along with Greg Ballard or Bill Benner or Scheller or Paul Okeson. So it was fun to talk with him.
I enjoy the ones like Michael where you're close to them and you have some rapport with them, and they're, I think that comes through. And I think you've gotten more comfortable with some of the historians like Michael Dobbs or Alan Gelzo, William Stearns Randall, who's going to become a friend of the program, I think.
He is coming back on, yes, to discuss his next book. But these guys, there's a saying that you should never meet your hero, right? Like, you're going to be disappointed. But at the same time, like Michael Dobbs, right? I read his book about the Cuban Missile Crisis. I don't know how many years ago it was that I read it. He agreed to come on in August to talk about his book about Nixon and Watergate. And I asked him to come back on to talk about the Cuban Missile Crisis. And I get a real kick out of it.
Yeah.
Because these guys are real experts, and I've read their book or their books, or I see their names every day as I walk through my house. Right. And now they've come on my podcast. It's not an ego boost. It's more of just some sort of, it's just fun. I can't think of another word for it.
It's like collecting basketball cards and getting to get the autograph of the guy that is on the card. That's the attitude that I think you bring to it. When you told me David O. Stewart was coming on, I had read his book about the creation of the Constitution 15 years ago, and he's always been one of the historians that I've watched and read his books, and I was like, you're having him on? It is a thrill to get to listen to these guys, talk to them. George Will, that isn't out yet, but just like getting to watch you interview George Will, was really interesting. And in that you asked him about baseball, and I kind of, and I know people haven't heard this yet, but it leads to a question. Like, you started off and talked for a fair amount about baseball with George Will. Why would you do that? He's a political guy. Why wouldn't you talk about politics with George Will for, a good portion of the interview?
Well, Will's known for his passion for baseball. Like, he's very well known for how much he loves the game, has loved the game since he was a kid.
But my question is, like, do you do research to find things about a person that's kind of out of the vein of the thing that they're known for as a way to make them more comfortable? Or is it, why make those choices? Because you do it somewhat often, and I'm not saying it's not a criticism. I'm saying, like, why is it a choice that you make?
Well, we do want them to be comfortable on the podcast. I mean, particularly for Mr. Will, I said I didn't really want to talk about modern politics. I wanted to talk about history because he's a huge history buff, and baseball a little bit. And I think the podcast is basically split into 3 different segments: baseball, Mitch Daniels, and history. And, I think that's, maybe people need a break from politics from time to time. Lord knows it's hard enough to do. I mean, if there were there are probably some other political commentators I could get on the podcast, just because I could think that they would do it because they're on other podcasts and their email's pretty public and it wouldn't be that hard. And quite frankly, I would drop George Will's name as someone who'd already been on, right? That would make it easier. Now the question becomes, what am I going to talk about? Because I don't want to do a 60 minutes on immigration or abortion or, the tax code. So it has to be a little bit more personal. We had, and this was, I think, last year, maybe not 2021, but Lou Gehrig and Bill Morrow on. And it was great to talk to Lou Gehrig, who's a Republican PR strategist, about what it was like working in the White House on the day that Ronald Reagan got shot.
Yeah.
I mean, am I going to have Lou Gehrig on and talk about Reagan's tax cuts, or what did Reagan really think of Paul Volcker? Who cares?
Right.
Tell us about when the phone rang and someone said the president's been shot.
Or Mitch Daniels on 9/11.
Yeah, that was terrific. It was just amazing.
Yeah.
And those are the kind of things that I think that allows our audience to grow and gets us some of the kudos that we've received. Plenty of political / policy / partisan podcasts out there, and they're not hard to find.
So do you, if you want to give your favorite episode of the year or favorite interview, go ahead. But I will ask it this way because I don't want they're all my children, I can't possibly choose of the 52. As a podcast host myself, there are some podcasts that you walk away and you go, I nailed that. I killed it. And then there's a bunch where you walk away and you go, that was mediocre, or I really sucked on that one. Was there an interview this year that you walked away feeling like that was really good? If that were like, that's my showcase episode, which one would it be?
Probably Susanna Lipscomb.
Yeah.
Because I had to prep really hard for that. Not that I don't know, I hate to say a lot about Tudor history. I mean, I guess compared to the average person, maybe I do. Right. Yeah. But
you're aware that the Middle Ages and the medieval era are the same thing. So you're ahead of the game.
So, but when you're talking to someone, and this is specific, right? When you're talking to someone who's written a book on a subject, they'll know within 30 seconds that if you say the 15th century and you really mean the 1500s, that you probably are not sufficiently prepared. So I worked really hard because I was honored that she would give us the time. I mean, she's in Oxford and I'm here in Indianapolis, Indiana, right? Like, I'm not going to do anything for her. She's not going anywhere with me. She just loves history and I can't really do anything for her. She didn't really know anything. I hadn't really had any European historians on the podcast, right? So it's not like she could listen to 4 of her friends who had been on before. And she really just kind of did it out of the kindness of her heart. And I worked really hard to ask questions that I thought that she wouldn't get asked, had not yet been asked. And I'm pretty sure that came through in the podcast, that there were questions that weren't gotcha, right? They weren't like, how dare you? But, what's the most impactful unexpected death, or who's the most underrated or overrated, or this sort of thing. If you could go back in time and box anyone's ears, who would you choose? Those sorts of questions. And you could tell when she's answering them that she's given it real thought, because she doesn't have a pat answer, because that's not a question she had heard before.
She lots of pauses and, oh gosh, never thought of that before. Yeah.
Yeah, she did do that quite a bit.
Yeah.
Mitch Daniels was another one that I was communications director at the Indiana Republican Party for a time period when he was governor. I was working for Greg Ballard in the mayor's office for a time period. He's the seminal Republican political figure of my lifetime. And to be able to ask him questions, he's intimidating because he can be short and he's intelligent, and his expectations are always high, high, high. And so I wanted to make sure that I made that podcast, worth its time.
How long do you prep for an episode?
It depends if I have a book to read. If I have an entire book to read before they come on, a month. But, Kip 2 and Murray Clark, those two,
right. There
was no prep. It's just like, let me introduce the two of you and let you go have some fun. And it was fun. It was fun in the sense that they both respect each other. They'd known each other for years and years. They'd been through the wars on opposite side. So, there was a big vibe of the, good morning, Ralph. Good morning, Sam, from the old Saturday morning cartoons, where you clock in, you beat the hell out of each other, and then you clock out and you see each other at a fundraiser, at an event, or at the ball game, and you just laugh about what you did. I can tell you on more than one occasion, I've run into a Democrat elected official and said to them, after a brief, respectful conversation, I hope you remember this, because in about 2 hours, I'm going to be interviewed about what a lousy job you're doing.
So what interview left you with the most questions unasked?
Mitch Daniels. I wish we'd have had more time, but we didn't have a lot of time. I think we got an hour barely, but there were probably a half dozen or more questions that I still wanted to ask that we just didn't have time to get through.
Yeah.
But,
Mitch, do you want to tattle on yourself? We took more time than on both of those.
Yeah,
interviews.
We took more time than we were supposed to. He looked at his watch a couple of times, pointed at it at least one time, and then that was to wrap it up. And then we had to come up with a brand new 5 questions for him, because that was his second time on. I would say, conversely, I thought that I wasn't going to get to near as many questions as we did with Evan Bayh. I mean, he gave us a huge chunk of time.
Yeah.
He was very generous.
Very generous with his time, yeah.
And that was something I didn't necessarily expect. I would say that of the people who I interviewed, or we talked to, you just kind of sometimes get amazed at how much Paul Page has packed into his life.
Oh my gosh, we didn't even get to a quarter of it. The book is great, by the way. John Elrod, former what was he, state rep? State senator? Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Good guy.
Great guy. He ghost wrote that book. The book is really, really good.
The book is really good. If you love Indianapolis, especially along with motorsports, buy Paul Page's book. It's terrific.
But just, getting to go to his museum of a house, and, him taking an hour with us after the interview to show, that was a ton of fun. Al Jr., I'm a big race fan. It is fun to go and do the interviews in person. I do kind of miss some of that.
And Alonso Jr. has been involved in 2 or 3 absolutely iconic races, and be able to ask him, okay, what's going through your mind? As was it Scott Goodyear?
Yeah.
It was he and Goodyear had the super close finish, in 91 or 92 or whatever. And, what are you thinking as all this is going on? You're trying to figure things out at 200 plus miles an hour.
Of all the guests, who would you have the most fun having dinner with?
Well, Susanna Lipscomb would be one. I keep going back to poor Susanna. God love her. Dr. Lipscomb, if you're in any way paying attention to this, please forgive me. There were so many other questions I wanted to ask of her from other historical time periods. I've never had a meal with Mitch Daniels. I've sat down and talked to him, briefly. I would say this
would he be the most fun?
If we were talking about history.
Yeah.
I've had lunch with him and P.E. McAllister, and, the three of us talked about history for an hour and 15 minutes straight. No politics, really, nothing else. I mean, it really is something where you can sit down with 4 or 5 people, and if that's what your shared interest is in, you can have a lot of fun. I would say that I learned a lot about Julia Carson when I was doing the research for the podcast we did on her, especially her emphasis on home ownership. And that's a talking point I've used in my public relations practice more than once. But the other thing I would say is that we interviewed Ted Widmer, who wrote Lincoln on the Verge, a book about Lincoln's journey from Springfield, Illinois, to Washington, D.C. for his inauguration. That book is one of the 10 best books I've ever read on any subject. If you have not read Lincoln on the Verge, you are missing out. It is positively brilliant, with a strong chapter about Lincoln's stay here in Indianapolis when he was on his journey. So to have him come on the podcast, I thought was a real coup. He was a terrific guest, and the book is just simply superb. The other thing I would say, go ahead, the story that we got, and I forget who the author was who was talking about it. And that's the story. I don't think it might have been Fergus Borderwich who wrote the book Congress at War, about the United States Congress during during the Civil War. But actually, the more I think about it, it was Ted Widmer who told the story about Vice President Breckinridge, John C. Breckinridge, who was had the responsibility to count the electoral votes after the election of 1860, and who performed this task in accordance with his constitutional duties. Then when he was done being Vice President of the United States under James Buchanan, immediately became a Confederate general. And subsequently, I think he became Confederate Secretary of War. So here's a man who became a complete traitor. There's no other way to say it. Traitor to his country, fought against his fellow Americans, but still did his duty under the Constitution or whatever directed him as such, to make sure the electoral votes for an election that he had to completely and totally disagree with, considering he was one of the candidates, and certainly abhorred the election of Abraham Lincoln. But he did his duty, and he did it as he should have. And that was just a terrific lesson, considering what was asked of Vice President Pence following the 2020 election.
Yeah, and Dan Quayle factored into that story too. I mean, what are the chances Dan Quayle would come on the program? I mean, have you tried?
I have not tried, but I'd certainly like to have him on for sure. He's factored into a couple other podcasts that we've had, but yeah, absolutely.
I'm fascinated. I'm fascinated by him because he just sort of he left, and I don't know what he's in Arizona, I think. You never really hear about him much. He just sort of is probably living the best life ever. Not in politics.
Well, my understanding is and I don't know this, and there are people in Indiana who've worked with him and for him, obviously. He's some sort of investment person or whatever, and has got a gargantuan fortune. So it turned out all right for him, for sure.
Yeah. So I remember there was, I don't know if I had to go to the restroom or I had another podcast to do or something. There was one particular, and I cannot remember the name of the historian, but I think I had to just close out the Zoom and let you two keep talking. which of the historians do you think you just could talk to about hours, maybe debating or conversing? I mean, which of them did you find personally did you spark with the most, that you could talk to the longest?
David O. Stewart, who wrote the book on George Washington, he was a really good interview. I don't know how many books I've read on Washington. I'm guessing 20, 25. He was real. I could have certainly talked to him quite a bit more. We did a couple of World War II podcasts, one with Andrew Nagorski and one with Stephen Fritz. They were both really cool. As a kid, I can only speak for myself. World War II was just such a huge event, listening to Victory at Sea as a kid, because my parents had the album. So to be able to ask a lot of questions about that, that was really fascinating. Obviously, Dr. Lipscomb, there were so many other questions I could have asked of her. I'm a huge Nixon fan. As we wrap up the podcast, a huge Nixon fan. So to be able to talk to Michael Dobbs about his Watergate research was fascinating. It's the first event I can remember as a kid is Watergate summer 73. And so that was fascinating because, everybody gets intrigued by Nixon, no matter who you are. Everyone is. R's, D's, it doesn't matter because he's just such a polarizing and yet kind of transcendent figure of post-World War II history.
Charming in a weird way, but repulsive. I don't know. He's fascinating.
Brilliant. He's awkward. He's devious. He's somewhat persecuted. And so, we want to keep doing that. And you've been a big supporter of doing these history podcasts with these authors. And, hopefully we can grow that side of Leaders and Legends. And then at the same time, not lose our Hoosier flavor. And there's so many more people yet to talk to. Well, including Abdul, who we've never had on.
How is that possible? I was Abdul's producer. He's my first job. My first real job was working for Abdul at WXNT. He was in my first wedding. He would have been in the second one. Probably would have. If it had been here, he would have officiated it. And you obviously, that's where we met, was when you and how have we not have Wagner on?
Because she's respectable now.
Oh, please.
Jennifer Wagner is very respectable.
You'll never be too. How could you be? You can't be respectable and not have been on this podcast.
We need to have Abdul on. Probably maybe towards the end of session or even during it. He's one of my favorite people, as I know you love him as well.
Absolutely. I love Abdul. Yeah, I don't know how we haven't had him. I think you should have him and Wagner on at the same time, relive the glory days.
Yeah, that may be my next. That'd be a good bipartisan, almost tripartisan podcast, assuming that we can get Shella on or just have, maybe you could host.
I'll host. I'll referee. You got to have, Abdul has to have his own episode because Abdul has a character that he plays, and people don't know the real Abdul a lot of times. And from his son Glenn and that story to his wife to, all that stuff. It gets lost in the Joe Fridays. And we also have a very cool podcast coming up, which we're going to get scheduled, in which Dr. Katie Jenner, the Indiana Secretary of Education, I interview Danielle Shockey. Oh, cool.
She gets to be a guest.
Really?
Yes.
Oh, that's a trip.
That is correct.
Right. Okay.
So Katie made that suggestion, and I jumped all over it. It'd be fun.
Yeah.
We've had Shella as a guest. We've had Bill Benner as a guest. And so if we can get Danielle on as a guest, then all of our co-hosts will have taken a shot at the 5 questions.
Yes. All right. Well, I don't think I should ask you the 5 questions again. You'd have to go back to your...
Have I asked you the 5 questions?
You have not asked me the 5 questions. No.
All right.
Are you going to ask me them now? Oh, man. As many times as I've heard these, I don't know that I'm ready, but go ahead.
What was your first job?
My dad ran a janitorial company that cleaned every Bank One in central Indiana. And I worked for a summer cleaning Bank Ones, but buildings downtown. I cleaned the Indianapolis Bar Association, and I cleaned the Harrison building, including the office of Ed Tracy. and I stole a Hershey's Kiss from Ed Tracy's candy dish, and I was chastised by my father for thievery. So it was funny to get to tell that story to Ed Tracy later. I would think I was like 12 or 13.
What was your first concert?
Styx, and Bad Company. Styx, great show. I hate their music. Bad Company was great though.
If you could suggest any book for someone to read, which book would you recommend?
Scary Close by Donald Miller. It is a book about Donald Miller's this great author who's written fiction. He's written the best books on marketing that I've ever read, but he wrote this book about his own journey through therapy. And it was really life-changing for me, and I've given that book out probably more than any other.
If you could witness any event in history, be there in person as it happens, which event would you choose?
See, this is the hardest one, and I thought about this past week, actually. I'd say the number one answer is the Sermon on the Mount. I've read the Sermon on the Mount probably every month for 20 years since I became a Christian. So I'd love to see that in person, but I just read Lawrence Bergen's book on Columbus while in the Dominican Republic. And I don't know if it tops out the Sermon on the Mount, but I think seeing Columbus interact with, the Native Americans on Hispaniola for the first time, I think that would have been really fascinating. But from the native perspective, to see like their culture, what it was like, and then to see, I think that would have been an interesting moment in history.
Do you get the sense of the 5 questions, the hardest one for them to answer, is the book? I think that's the one where they stumble on the most.
Yeah.
Because your first job and your first concert are objective.
Yes.
And the last 3 are subjective.
Yeah, it's hard to, especially historians, a person who loves history, I could list probably 40 things that I'd love to see. Like when I get to heaven, that's what I want to. I want to see the whole highlight reel. I want to see the Revolution. I want to see Lincoln. I want to see all of it. Julius Caesar crossing the Rubicon. That's a really hard one. The book is pretty hard. The hardest one, I think, is who to have dinner with. And that's why they always default to Bush or Obama or their wife or something boring.
So you just spent a week with your wife, so she's out. If you could have dinner with anyone 2 hours off the record to talk about anything you want.
Man, this is the hardest one for me because I have a lot of different interests. I'm a Christian, so there's always like Christian people that I'd want to meet and talk with. Man, I'd love Mitch Daniels would be an answer because I would want to know what is different about him. I've heard all these stories about him through this podcast, and I'd want to see what makes him tick. Trump, just because I'd love to see what he's really like. He's probably pretty funny. Oh gosh, I don't know. Who was your answer? What was your answer?
I can't remember what my exact answer. I could. There's no possible way in hell I could pass up 2 hours with Paul McCartney.
See, if I'd
have to say Paul McCartney over any political official. There's so many historians, but I mean, Paul McCartney is probably the most famous person in the world, not a pope, not a president, not a monarch.
See, I had to, yes, but I had to explain to my 27-year-old wife who Paul McCartney was a couple weeks ago. Now,
and you married her anyway.
Yeah. I mean, I'm the biggest Beatles fan. I mean, the Beatles anthology came out in 95 when I was a kid. I actually watched and enjoyed the thing on Disney. If you're not a deep Beatles fan. See, McCartney would be fun, but he'd have to tell you the truth. My thing about McCartney is that I think he kind of gives you the good PR answer. You'd probably want to go with Ringo, because Ringo one-on-one with a couple drinks is going to tell you all the stories that you don't hear about the Beatles, because those guys were going wild. But those stories have never really leaked out too much. I think my answer is actually going to be Jonah Goldberg. I have flirted with the idea of being an aspiring political analyst one day. And I think I love his podcast, The Remnant, where he just talks by himself and waxes on poetically about nothing. And he just has such an interesting perspective on so many different things. He kind of doesn't give a crap anymore because he was not a Trump person, and he's kind of been excommunicated, but he worked with Buckley at National Review. He started The Corner and kind of changed the face of the National Review. He started the Dispatch. He's fairly libertarian, but he's just had a really interesting career, and I think I'd love to get some tips from him, and I think he'd be a fun conversation. He had dinner with Hitchens, lived in the same building, would go to Hitchens, and he's like, I can't tell you all the stories. So he's always talking about how he has all these stories about people that are like leaders and legends in the conservative political space. And I think he'd be a really fun 2-hour dinner that you'd have.
He's certainly brilliant, that's for sure.
Yeah.
And he's very well, he expresses himself very well.
Yeah.
That's for sure. You have been listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, a local veteran public relations enterprise, and sponsored by Girl Scouts of Central Indiana, Garmon Construction, Leaders and Legends LLC, the Grand Hall and Conference Center at Historic Union Station, the McGinley's Golden Ace Inn, and McAllister Machinery, your friendly neighborhood Caterpillar dealer. Thank you very much, Chris, for hosting this episode as we look back on the year 2021. We have some terrific podcasts coming up in 2022. Thank you so very much for listening. If you have any ideas as to who we should have on, and we've taken people's ideas and turned them into shows, please contact us at leadersandlegends.net. That's leadersandlegends.net. Thank you, Chris, again. Congratulations on your nuptials.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much for listening to Leaders and Legends, brought to you by Veteran Strategies Incorporated. If you want to contact us about this program or our menu of public relations services, please send us an email at robert@veteranstrategies.com. That's robert@veteranstrategies.com.